everyone, and welcome to today's episode of the Top Producing Zone podcast. I'm one of your hosts, Michael Jin.
And I'm your co-host, Shane Carvalho.
We got a fun one for you today. It's not something that everyone always likes to talk about, but it's a really important topic to talk about, and that's money. And not just money, but also how to keep track of not only your revenue, but your expenses, and why profit is really the key metric that you should be tracking in your business.
Yeah, Michael, and I agree. And it's interesting too, because obviously after, knowing you for a while and you and your magic spreadsheets, um, I know that you probably know to the cent where you're at year to date. And, a lot of us in real estate, especially me, I mean, it's been so many years now that, we get into the business and, we're all concerned about learning the business and training on how to sell and everything else, but nobody really teaches you that, hey, that 1099, that gross money, that's not all your money. And so, I'm excited to kind of dive into, just some tips and tricks on how to manage your income. And then, I'll let you be analytical with, your detailed spreadsheets.
Yeah, I mean, we can talk about some of the tools and stuff, but I mean, I think you bring up a great point, which is, first let's start off on the let's start. I mean, with profit, you kind of have to talk about two sides of the equation, right? You got to talk about the revenue side, which I think a lot of people are, especially agents, are really good about knowing, right? Because it's something you can certainly use to advertise, how well you're doing in the business. And then there's the other side that people don't really keep track of very well, which is the expense side. But even on the revenue side, you brought up an interesting point. It's like, as realtors, we get 1099s from our brokerages.
Mhm.
Uh, we don't pay taxes. It's not like a corporate paycheck where you have deductions, on
Right.
every paycheck where you pay a portion of federal tax, state tax, Social Security, all this other stuff. And so that's one important thing. If you're not aware of your 1099 where you're just getting started in the business, you probably should realize that paycheck that you get, to your point, Shane, that's not your net income that you're getting. That revenue number is going to go down, and it's going to go way down once you
Right.
actually have to pay your taxes.
Right. And so, I mean, these numbers have grown. Like, sure, there's inflation, but then, appreciation, in our market. And so it's like, early in my career, it's like I used to get excited about a $4,000 paycheck. That was just exciting as heck. But, as we've progressed and the market's progressed and appreciation, inflation, everything else, now, when you have checks come at you for 40 or $50,000, I mean, you can get in a lot of trouble if you don't manage things properly. And I know many a transaction coordinator at some of the brokerages that talk about, how many IRS payment plans they contribute to for the sake of agents on a monthly basis. We don't want to be those agents. It can happen to the best of us, being, busy on the day to day. And if you're not keeping track, I mean, we all can be in for a surprise. Um, I know this is like a pretty large topic, and I know that, we could really get carried away, but I guess maybe I'll start off with maybe tackling, some just kind of my growth strategy after talking to my CPA on how I tackle things. So, first of all, being self employed, you file a Schedule C on your taxes. Being self employed, being 1099, your CPA will file a Schedule C for you. And being that we're in California, we pay federal and state tax. So, what he'll do is, based on my previous year's income, he'll figure out what my quarterly payments are. So, it's important to make quarterly tax payments to keep yourself on track tax wise. So, the way I manage this is every basically check that comes in, I already have, about 10 to 15,000 in, costs for the transaction that already come out. And I have 5% that the brokerage takes towards my stock, that I purchase, because I can purchase up to 5% of each, stock. And so, aside from this, I transferred 30% into a business savings. And that 30% is what I attribute to like tax money. And then I pretty much take another percentage and I've had to adjust it just based on what personal expenses are. But I try to take like a monthly transfer of personal expenses, which are anything that's not in the business. Because like my vehicle for work is in the business, paid by the business, right? Like there's insurance for the business. There's a lot of costs that are under the business, but then there's personal expenses which are outside. And so I mean it's gonna be different for everybody, but I try to, basically break things out as these, checks come in. And I'm so used to saying checks, but since COVID, they're pretty much wire transfers.
Right.
So when the wire transfer comes in, I have all my accounts connected with the same bank. So I just transfer money around. In a perfect world, when everything's flowing really well and there's never any kind of financial challenges or anything or any big obligations or what have you, you can be pretty effective with this. And then as far as your quarterlies, you hope that they go up every year because like my CPA always reminds me, the more you pay, the more you make.
Mhm.
So it's important that you do keep up with your estimateds and not, if you're really growing and you want to be more successful every year, then you got to be able to adjust what you're paying. You should be paying more every year.
Well, and I think, you bring up interesting like point too, is because I think you have grown your business to the point where you have, both like a professional CPA and like kind of your bookkeeper that will help you keep track of your expenses.
Kind of. I depend on
Well, that
her.
will. I know. That will. And I think, regardless of where you are in your business, like as you're growing out your business, I think, having a CPA, having someone that will help you prepare your taxes is definitely an important like partnership to get right. For those that may not be at a point in their business where they have a CPA, that's or where they might not have their own bookkeeper. That's where where Shane was trying to joke with me at the beginning, but that's where your friend Excel comes in handy quite a bit. It's if you can't afford any of these fancy expense tracking softwares or tools or bookkeepers, fancy. Well, I mean, there are things out there, right? There are things out there like programs and softwares that you can use to track the expenses for your business, right?
Yeah,
If you
you're
don't
you're
have
right
the
about
money to
that.
hire a bookkeeper, and if you can't afford that because you're just starting off, the easiest thing to do is get yourself a copy of Excel and track it yourself. That's one thing I started doing from the very beginning because I love my Excel spreadsheets and I just love making all these tracking tools. But when I started, I just use Excel. On the revenue side, it's I do track for every single transaction that I do. I track KPIs or I track like metrics like what was my list price, what's the sale price, how much did I make based off of that, what's my commission, right? And then from a commission perspective, then I calculate, okay, how much do I owe? How much am I paying to my brokerage? What are the various fees I have to pay? So then for every single transaction, I have a spreadsheet that breaks it down into each of these core categories. And not only does that help me figure out what my ultimate net take home pay is before taxes, certainly, but it also allows me over the course of a year to really see like how much have I paid into my brokerage. And then at the year end, that allows me then to do a checkup, so to speak, right? To say, okay, does it still make sense? Like what fees am I paying to my brokerage? Does it make sense what fees I'm paying, when it comes to a listing? Does it make sense the fees that I'm paying for a transaction coordinator? And overall, like then I can kind of assess, okay, the direct expenses I'm putting into my business, like, does it still make sense? Or are there other areas I need to dig into and try to see if there's ways that I can, improve some of my cost?
Right. No, and that's obviously super smart, super detailed. I mean, you're not an engineer by chance, are you?
Oh, I don't, how did you know?
No, I'm just saying, no, so going back to what you're saying with the costs, like, yeah, like the bookkeeper is very reasonable. CPAs can get expensive. But here's the thing is that another thing to keep in mind is like when I started as a solo agent before I even had an assistant, like you can do your own tracking and you keep things simple. But like when you grow, not just income, because obviously I bring in over seven figures, that's a lot of money to like try and manage without a professional.
Oh
Like
yeah,
you
absolutely.
you can get in a lot of trouble. You can have a lot. So that's one thing is the amount of money that comes in, but the other thing is multiple employees and payrolls and commercial leases and warehouses and staging and commercial vehicles. And so it's just like it gets to a point where you really, it's not a luxury, it's a necessity.
Right.
So I think that this is great that you and I are talking about this, because obviously we're on both ends of the spectrum. Like, you're experienced, but you've kind of kept like a solopreneur, right? Now part of the organization, but you're kind of like, that's kind of how I started, and so I think that, yeah, simple tracking methods is great, and then basically graduating to like a bookkeeper slash CPA, and then I mean, and then let's talk about, because I mean, there's the part about managing what comes in, but I mean, I think we also need to address, like, okay, we're talking about the revenue side and how to disperse that and how to track that. But then how about on the expense side, like the investment in the business and what you really have to spend? Like, how do you gauge how much you can invest? How do you gauge, is it a percentage? What can you spend? Like, for me, I got to a point where I thought, okay, you know what? I'm going to invest 10% of my revenue into marketing. That was kind of a metric I came up with, right?
Right.
But it's like, I mean, what's your take on that? Like, how do you structure what you can spend?
Well, I think part of that is really understanding like your overall numbers, right? Like you have a baseline. Let's say so for you and I as an example, right? We make certain income out of real estate. There's also a baseline of costs that we have for, everyday living, right? So we have to understand that. You have to track that. You have to realize on a monthly basis what you're spending already, right? You have to so that's kind of your baseline cost, I would think, on a monthly basis. And then you have to then take a look at, for each listing, like how much are you making, right? And then you get it ultimately, like, so you came up with the metric of 10% for your marketing costs, right? But not everyone may be able to do that. But that's kind of, again, goes back to tracking, for me at least, tracking down to that individual listing level. Because with each listing, then, again, with my spreadsheets, I like to get fancy. I like to put in percentage levers, right? And
Right.
when I put in percentage levers, then I can kind of do a sensitivity analysis and figure out, like, okay, on average, with the listing here in San Jose, what is my average profit margin on like $1 million home, on a $1.5 million home, right? And then based on that and how much profit I'm making, then I can tell myself, okay, I might need to sell 10 homes a month, right? To have a healthy enough margin to where I can put 10% into marketing. I look at it that way.
Wow. Those are some lofty goals there, Mr. Jen.
Well, I'm using that as an example, right? But what I'm trying to say is, like, you have to model. For me, I like to model out, okay, what is my baseline number of transactions I have to do to cover my living expenses every month? And then from that percentage, then from there, then I have to figure out, okay, how much more do I need to sell to be able to maintain like a 10% marketing budget on every listing that I have?
Yeah, no, that makes sense. I mean, well, but then the thing for me though too is that, and this is where it gets tricky, is that, like, yeah, you know what your baseline living costs are and what your like baseline like business costs are.
Thanks for joining us for today's episode. Now, if you're watching on YouTube or streaming this on your podcast platform, if you could do us a favor, leave a comment down below and let us know where you're listening or watching the show from today. It greatly helps with the algorithm and helps us get reach out to more people who need or want to hear what we have to say. We greatly appreciate it. And now back to the show. With you and your business right now, like, what do you feel like is a healthy profit margin for yourself?
Realistically, and I've tried to cut, because there's only so much you can do in cutting overhead. Like the last couple of years, obviously, there's been, for me, I know that there's been some missteps on overhead cost. Like, there's certain things I should have done differently so I wouldn't have so much overhead. But I think that it's safe to say that a 30% profit margin, believe it or not, you would think it'd be more, but a 30% profit margin for me the last 4 or 5 years is healthy, but that just, of course, it's going to vary, right? Because, if you're bringing in 100,000 a year and your profit margin is 30%, like, that's probably tough to even be able to live, right? So
Right.
those numbers adjust as you grow. And then the other thing too is that it's also based on if you're volume play or if you're doing less transactions on a higher dollar, because that can matter too. I mean, if you're doing a ton of volume, because see, that's one of my issues, for instance, is I don't cherry pick, right? So it's like, I'm going to list a $600,000 house and still probably spend 10,000 on marketing, staging, everything else. Whereas, I'll list a $3 million house and maybe that number's 15,000. But when you look, or even 20,000 sometimes, but then when you look at the gross commission on each and you look at those costs, you see how the percentages just go out the window.
Yeah.
Like literally, like you're helping maybe a repeat client or referral or whatever sell something at 600, but it's not really technically profitable when you really like take out all your costs and taxes and everything. It's, and I know that in business, like you win some, you lose some, or things kind of average out. But you see what I'm saying? If I average, I know there's not that many properties that cheap in our market, but even if I only averaged $800,000 transactions versus averaging $2 million transactions, I mean, that's going to be a huge difference.
Oh, it
Like
will be. Yeah.
the profit margin on the lower transactions, I mean, I'd be lucky to eke out like a 10% profit margin. But if I was averaging 2 million transactions, then, I could probably get to 40 or 50%. You see what I'm saying? So it's just, that's what I'm
Well,
saying. It's
and on
tricky.
every individual transaction, I think to your point, like the profit margins are going to be super different, right? I think on aggregate, you probably want to hit some kind of target, right?
Yeah, no, you do, but then that's the thing too, is that to be consistent, then like for me, like some people will be like, I'm just in this neighborhood or I'm just in this price point or whatever. But for me, it's like, repeat and referral, that's the heart of my business. And if I end up with, 10, $800,000 transactions in a row, or 10, $3 million transactions in a row, like I'm not necessarily targeting, right? I'm targeting the fact that I built these relationships and I want to keep working with this clientele, but I'm not targeting. So, to get your aggregate, do you see what I'm saying?
Well, I mean, I think the more important thing is, and I think kind of the message I want to convey, at least in this episode, is that, like to what we've kind of talked about is, the profit margins they're gonna vary, they're gonna aggregate. Like on aggregate, they might be at a certain level, right? Some might be lower, some might be higher. But I think the more important thing, and I think the message we're trying to convey here, though, is that it's just important to try to at least get a better gauge, right, of what your business does look like on a monthly and on an annual basis, right? Like you at least want to know whether or not you're making like ten thousand
Well,
dollars in
yeah,
profit versus $20,000 in profit, right? Or you're making nothing in profit. Like that is kind of one of the most important things that you do have to figure out.
you're right. I'm kind of going into the weeds on that. I mean, obviously, like I'm going a little too deep there, but I was just saying that, it's just I was kind of curious to see what your take was on what a good profit margin is. I mean, it's just hard to believe that, we run on over a 50% cost. Like that, just I had a really hard time with that, and I've analyzed and tried to figure out how to get that down. And it's like I said earlier, like there's a certain level of where overhead is what it is. You just got to go make more money, right? I
Right.
mean,
Yeah. That's
there's a certain point that's it. Like here's your baseline, and it's going to be at 50 or 60% if you don't go make more money.
well, and that's part of the reason, like as you kind of progress in your business, like year over year, why it's important to very much understand like not just how much revenue you bring in, but also your expenses, right? Because over time you can see how your expenses change, right? If they do at all or not, right? Or do they keep pretty consistent? Because you're going to have fixed expenses every year, right? Whatever that might be. Like to your point, like you having like a CPA, you having a bookkeeper, you having support staff, there's a certain amount of fixed cost every year, right?
Right.
And then your variable cost on top is dependent on potentially how many listings you have, right? And what you're spending on marketing, what you're spending on fixing some of these listings before you go to market. It is good to understand like how your expenses trend over the years from year over year, because then you have a better sense of, okay, like there's only, to your point, there's only so many levers I can pull on the expense side to be able to cut costs, right?
Right.
Because your fixed costs often will stay the same year over year over year. Then it comes to, okay, what are the other levers I have to play with? And then you have to go back to the revenue side. And price points in this area, like, relatively consistent, right, on average. And so then to your point, it just becomes the only lever you have to pull then is the volume lever on the revenue side, right? Which means you just have to sell more and more and more. And you have to figure out, okay, so if I have like 50,000 a year in expenses, like what is my break even point at a minimum, right? And that's what you have to at least get to, right? And then you build on top of that.
Well, the other thing too is that, one thing that I've thought about adjusting at different points the last couple of years is whether or not I want to charge some kind of a fee, especially on the lower price listings. But it's like, it's hard because, especially if you're repeat clients, your referrals, it's like you don't want someone to feel like they're getting special treatment, and someone else has to pay. Because then it's going to be a little complicated, if basically you're like, okay, well, um, here's my cousin or whatever, they want to sell their house kind of like we did, but it's like then their cousin lives in some town out in the boonies where their house is only like 300,000, but your other clients was 1.5 million. It's like it's hard because you can't be like, oh yeah, sorry cousin, I know I staged for your cousin, but I can't stage for you, you're gonna have to pay. You see what I'm saying? It's like you
Right.
don't really want to get into the minutia because then they're going to be like, well, but my cousin says you include staging, or you. So you see what I'm saying? So it's like
Yeah.
I've kicked that around, and it's like really at the end of the day that becomes more of a volume play. Okay, if you're going to have a bunch of referrals that happen to be in lower price points, well, you better be really pushing to sell what you can and really just focus on the volume versus just specific transactions. Because I mean, we do the math. $500,000 transaction is five $2.5 million. You know what I mean? It's like
Yeah.
$500,000 transactions is a $2.5 million transaction. And if you think about it, you just 5x the cost. You literally just increased your costs by 500% for the same revenue. That's crazy.
It is. It is. And so it's one of those things where it's like if listening to this episode and hearing about these numbers is making your mind just kind of go crazy because, not everyone's a numbers person.
I love numbers.
I know, I do too, but not everyone is, right? And so if you guys find yourself needing help with, keeping track of your expenses or whatnot, like reach out to me, reach out to Shane. Like I'm happy to share any of the Excel stuff that I've come up with to help me track my business expenses. I'm happy to share with you guys. And the other thing, like there's another tool, and again, like it doesn't really matter. It's kind of like CRMs, right? It doesn't really matter what tool you use. Just start tracking your expenses, right?
Just use it.
Just use it. Just use something
Actually
that
use
will
the
work for
tool.
you. Yeah, use something that'll work for you, right? It could be Excel if you like Excel. If you want another resource, one thing I've discovered recently is actually Airtable. And I know we use it on our team to kind of track our listings. But within Airtable, you can actually do a really cool thing. You can set it up so that it's basically like Excel on a platform. And it has a much easier to understand like user interface. And so one thing that I've started doing with my listings is now I have a CRM, or now I have a listing spreadsheet database, how I track my active and completed closed listings. But then for each listing in Airtable, I can also add in Excel formulas so I can keep track of the same things I used to keep track of in Excel, just now do it in Airtable. And with an Airtable, you can then create different sheets and pages, and you can link it all together with like your listing worksheet. So then I can keep track of all my business expenses in Excel. I can have a page where I can summarize, what my total commission is in Airtable. I can summarize what my total expenses on various listings are. I can bucket and categorize it out. And it's just a much cleaner interface to slice and dice versus, having to go into Excel and building your own graphs and things like that. So again, if that sounds interesting to you guys, like whether it's Excel or Airtable, shoot us and I shoot us a private message, DM over social media, shoot us an email, reach out to us, and we'll happily share that with you to help you in your business.
Thanks, Michael. Yeah, I appreciate that. Obviously, you'll be a lot more help with the fancy spreadsheets. but I'm always, obviously I'm good with the numbers, and I'm always happy to discuss. But yeah, and I guess along those lines, I mean, obviously we've looked at revenue, we looked at expenses, and we've talked a little about taxes, CPA, bookkeeper, etc. But then lastly, like banking, right? So uh, let's talk about bank accounts, and this is another one that and I cringe. Uh, you need to have a business bank account for your real estate business. You have to have a separate personal account. Like you really like, and I can't say this enough because I can't tell you how many people I come across are not set up this way. And not to bash anybody, a lot of people just don't know or don't understand, but you should set up a business account. All your real estate income should go into that business account. Your real estate expenses should come either out of that account or out of a credit card that's a business credit card that you pay out of that account, so that the books can be kept properly. And then that money in that account is not your money, that's your business's money. Then whatever your personal budget is, you can transfer that into a personal account. So you should have a business checking, business savings, personal checking, and personal savings. I mean, that's really, you should be set up at least like that, just
What
basic.
and I totally agree. Like, what is your perspective on setting up an LLC?
Well, I mean, I have different LLCs for different businesses, and I'm obviously a big fan. I think that depending on your situation, like obviously it's my attorney that sets those up who's really good with LLCs. I think that you should consult with an attorney that does the LLCs and figure out what the best corporate structure is for you, right? Because some people it makes sense to be a C corp, some people an S corp, some people an LLC. Here in California, and I know it's an IRS thing as well, but like to incorporate the real estate business and to be an employee of my real estate business, I had to get my broker's license. And so I'm not 100% sure if it's like that in all states, if that's a federal thing or a state thing, but you want to consult with your CPA and an attorney. Like I wouldn't just like go online and go set up your like $10 LLC,
Right. Yeah.
because
Pay for
I
those
mean everybody
online
wants to do it on
consultants.
their own and save money.
Yeah.
Like I would get legal advice. So yeah, I'm a big fan of setting up an LLC or some kind of corporate structure. I mean, people when they think of LLCs, people always think about, getting away from liability. But obviously in this scenario, we're talking about for tax benefits, etc., more than like liability, because a lot of people talk about putting their properties under LLCs and such. But I think here with the corporate structure, we're kind of referring more to so because essentially, like if you're CPA and your attorney say, hey, set up your business as a C corp and then add yourself to payroll, and then you can figure out what your personal expenses are, so kind of what paycheck to take. But at the same time, they're also going to look at your cash flow and look at your income and figure out how much you should be getting in a check, because to a certain extent you're going to be somewhat double taxed to a certain extent, for lack of I'm not a CPA though, so I'm not giving tax advice, but I'm just saying, like, you're going to get a W-2, right? So then your corporation gets 1099, and then you'll actually get a check. And so, yeah, I mean, Michael, I definitely believe in LLCs. I use them. How about yourself? What are your thoughts?
I mean, I haven't personally gotten into an LLC. I think it's something that I do want to like explore further for myself. Like I think one for potential tax implications, but then also like to your point, and maybe we cover this in a future episode, is kind of the liability coverage and what that how that plays out. And I think the takeaway here though is whether it's you're looking at your bookkeeping, whether you're looking at your taxes, whether you're looking at how do you best structure and run your business, like you're not alone in this process, or don't feel like you have to figure everything out by yourself, right? Like even just on this episode, if you need the tools to be able to track like your business as you're starting off individually, you need spreadsheets, you need resources with that, like reach out to Shane and myself, we can help you with that. We can give you our tools. If you need help, recommendations with like CPAs, lawyers, if you're in California, like we have our own network of partners that we trust that we're happy to also try to help and refer you to also.
Yeah, and
But
then I was also gonna add too that like New York, Florida, like I mean I've really like we are strong in California and that's where we're at, so that's our network. But like I can tell you right now, like I'm naming like New York,
yeah,
Florida, Nevada. Like I do like I know myself, I do have additional contacts in other states. So I would say just overall just reach out and then we can possibly refer you to, people that we know in other states that we work with as well.
yeah. I think one of the key things, and again, this is not really related to profit, but I think the key to kind of running a successful business, whatever it is to really surround yourself with people who are experts in their field that you're not in, right? And so whether it comes to finances or legal matters or anything else, like we talked about in a previous episode, you want to build out a strong partner network of partnerships. And so just know that you're not alone in doing that. So if you need help in any way, reach out to us and we're happy to try to help you out and get you connected with the right people.
Thanks, Michael. 100%.
All right, guys. Well, I mean, obviously, with profit and revenue and expenses, we can dig into it a lot more. Today kind of was just a good overview episode, and hopefully, you pulled some nuggets out there. And hopefully, we'll hear from you soon if you want access to some of the tools that we use to help us manage our businesses. Um, hope you enjoyed this episode, and we will catch you on the next episode of the Top Producing Zone.
That's a wrap.